I never thought I would be standing on the sidewalk at 73 years old, watching my own daughter throw my belongings into garbage bags like I was nothing more than unwanted clutter. My name is Margaret, and I'm telling you this story because I need you to understand what it feels like when the people you raised, the people you sacrificed everything for, decide that you're an embarrassment to their perfect little world. The words still echo in my mind, cutting deeper than any knife ever could. Mom, you're ruining the aesthetic of our neighborhood. The neighbors are complaining. You need to go. Standing there in my worn house dress, the one I'd had for 15 years because I always put their needs before my own, I watched my daughter Jessica pack away my life like it meant nothing. My son-in-law Derek stood behind her with his arms crossed, that smug expression on his face that I'd grown to hate over the years. He was the one who had poisoned her against me, who had convinced her that having an old, poor mother living in their guest house was somehow beneath their social status. The humiliation was suffocating. Neighbors I had known for years peeked through their curtains, watching the spectacle of an elderly woman being discarded by her own family. Some of them had the decency to look ashamed, but others seemed almost entertained by my downfall. I had become the neighborhood gossip, the cautionary tale of what happens when you become a burden to your successful children. Jessica wouldn't even look me in the eye as she spoke. We found you a nice little apartment across town. It's more suitable for someone your age. The way she said, someone your age, made my skin crawl. As if age was a disease, as if the years I'd spent raising her, working 3 jobs to put her through college, sacrificing my own dreams so she could have hers, had somehow made me less worthy of respect and love. I thought about all the times I had defended her to others. All the times I had made excuses for her selfishness. All the times I had convinced myself that she was just going through a phase. But this wasn't a phase. This was who she had become. A woman so consumed with appearances and social status that she was willing to throw away her own mother like yesterday's trash. The pain in my chest was physical, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. I had given this woman everything. My youth, my health, my dreams, my entire life. And this was how she repaid me, by deciding that I was an inconvenience, an aesthetic problem to be solved by simply making me disappear from her perfect little world. Derek handed me an envelope with what he called moving expenses, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. This wasn't generosity. This was the price he was willing to pay to get rid of me. The amount was insulting, barely enough to cover a security deposit, let alone start a new life at my age. But what hurt more than the money was the message it sent. I was worth so little to them that they thought a few $100s would erase decades of love and sacrifice. As I stood there, clutching that pathetic envelope, I felt something inside me break. Not just my heart, though that was shattered beyond repair, but something deeper. My faith in family, my belief in unconditional love, my trust in the people I had given my life to protect and nurture. I realized in that moment that I was truly alone in the world, that the daughter I had raised had become a stranger who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to her happiness. But even as the tears streamed down my face, even as the humiliation threatened to crush me completely, I felt something else stirring in the depths of my soul. It was quiet at first, barely a whisper, but it grew stronger with each cruel word, each dismissive gesture, each moment of callous indifference. It was anger, yes, but more than that, it was determination. They thought they knew who I was, thought they understood what I was capable of. They had no idea how wrong they were. I looked at my daughter one last time, memorizing her face, the face I had kissed goodnight for 18 years, the face I had worried over through every fever and heartbreak. She was beautiful, successful, everything I had dreamed she would become, but she was also cold, calculating, and utterly without compassion for the woman who had made her success possible. In that moment, I made a silent promise to myself. This would not be the end of my story. They had underestimated me for the last time. Before I became the embarrassment they needed to hide, I was the foundation upon which their entire world was built. I was a single mother at 22, abandoned by Jessica's father when he decided that responsibility wasn't for him. I could have given up, could have wallowed in self-pity, but I had a daughter to raise and dreams to nurture. I worked 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night, waitressing during the day, and taking in sewing on weekends, just to keep us afloat. Our little apartment wasn't much, but I made it a home filled with love, laughter, and endless possibilities. I read to Jessica every night, even when my eyes burned from exhaustion. I helped her with homework at our tiny kitchen table, the same table where I balanced our meager budget and planned for a future I could barely afford to dream about. Every decision I made was centered around one question: what's best for Jessica? I remember the sacrifices so clearly, each one a small death of my own desires. I never bought new clothes, wearing the same 3 dresses to work for years because Jessica needed school supplies, dance lessons, and eventually college preparation courses. I never went on dates, never pursued relationships because every free moment belonged to my daughter. I never took vacations, never indulged in hobbies, never did anything that didn't directly benefit the child I loved more than life itself. When Jessica showed interest in ballet, I worked extra shifts to pay for lessons and costumes. When she wanted to learn piano, I sold my grandmother's jewelry to buy her an old upright piano that barely fit in our living room. When she dreamed of attending an expensive private college, I took out loans that would haunt me for decades, convinced that her education was worth any price. I was there for every recital, every school play, every parent-teacher conference. I cheered louder than anyone else at her graduation, tears streaming down my face as I watched the little girl I had raised walk across that stage. She was valedictorian, full scholarship to her dream school, everything we had worked so hard to achieve. In that moment, I felt like all the sacrifice had been worth it. College changed her, though I didn't see it at first. She came home less frequently, and when she did visit, she seemed embarrassed by our modest apartment, by my simple clothes, by the life that had made her success possible. She started making comments about bettering herself and moving up in the world, as if where she came from was something to be ashamed of rather than proud of. When she met Derek in her senior year, I knew immediately that he was trouble. He came from money, old money, the kind that looks down on people who have to work for a living. He was polite enough to my face, but I could see the judgment in his eyes, the way he assessed our humble surroundings and found them wanting. Jessica was smitten, completely blind to his condescending attitude and obvious disdain for anything that didn't meet his privileged standards. After graduation, Jessica got a job at a prestigious marketing firm, and Derek proposed with a ring that cost more than I made in a year. The wedding was everything she had ever dreamed of, elegant, expensive, and completely beyond my means to contribute to in any meaningful way. I felt like a charity case at my own daughter's wedding, dressed in a borrowed dress and seated at a table with people I didn't know, watching my daughter marry into a world that had no place for someone like me. They moved into Derek's family neighborhood, a place where the houses were mansions and the cars cost more than most people's homes. Jessica transformed herself to fit in, adopting new mannerisms, new interests, even a slightly different accent that sounded more refined, more educated, more worthy of her new social status. She invited me to visit, but I could feel the tension, the way she watched me nervously, afraid I might say or do something that would embarrass her in front of her new friends. For a while, I convinced myself that this was just an adjustment period, that once she settled into her new life, she would remember where she came from and who had helped her get there. I told myself that love would win out over social pressure, that the bond between mother and daughter was stronger than the desire to fit in with people who judged worth by bank account balances and zip codes. I was wrong. The daughter I had raised, the one who used to curl up in my lap and tell me I was the best mommy in the world, was disappearing, replaced by someone who saw me as a liability rather than a blessing. But I didn't give up hope. I kept believing that somewhere inside the woman she had become, the little girl I had loved so fiercely, was still there, waiting to remember what really mattered. The changes started subtly, so gradually that I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. Jessica's phone calls became shorter, more hurried, filled with excuses about being busy with work or social obligations. When I did visit, she would give me a quick tour of whatever new addition or renovation they had made to the house. But there was an underlying tension, as if she was showing off while simultaneously apologizing for my presence. Derek's behavior became more openly dismissive. He would make comments about different generations and changing times, always with a smile that never reached his eyes. He had a way of making me feel small without saying anything directly insulting, a skill that came from years of privilege and the confidence that comes with never having to worry about money or social status. I noticed how Jessica would change when her new friends were around. Her voice would become more refined, her posture more rigid, and she would introduce me with a forced cheerfulness that felt like an apology. "This is my mother," she would say, as if the word itself was something to be ashamed of. I could see the way her friends looked at me, taking in my simple clothes and modest appearance, making quick judgments about my worth based on superficial observations. The exclusions started small. A dinner party I wasn't invited to because it was just couples, a charity event that was too formal for someone like me, a family vacation that became a romantic getaway for just Jessica and Derek. Each excuse was reasonable on its own, but together they formed a pattern of deliberate isolation that cut deeper than any outright rejection. Jessica began to criticize things about me that had never bothered her before. My clothes were outdated, my opinions were old-fashioned, my stories about her childhood were embarrassing. She would roll her eyes when I spoke, interrupt me mid-sentence, or simply change the subject when I tried to share something important with her. I felt like I was becoming invisible in my own daughter's life. The financial judgments were particularly painful. Derek would make comments about fiscal responsibility and living within one's means, always directed at me despite the fact that I had managed to raise a successful daughter on a fraction of what they spent on a single dinner out. Jessica would nod along as if she had forgotten the years of sacrifice that had made her current comfort possible. I started to dread visiting them, but I couldn't stay away. Jessica was all the family I had, and despite her growing coldness, I still hoped that the loving daughter I had raised was somewhere inside the woman she had become. I made excuses for her behavior, told myself that she was just trying to fit in, that once she felt more secure in her new world, she would remember what really mattered. But the distance kept growing. Phone calls became text messages, visits became shorter and less frequent, and the warmth that had once defined our relationship was replaced by a polite formality that felt worse than outright hostility. I was becoming a stranger to my own daughter, an unwelcome reminder of a past she was trying desperately to escape. The breaking point came when I had a minor health scare. Nothing serious, just a dizzy spell that landed me in the emergency room for a few hours. I called Jessica from the hospital, expecting concern, maybe even a visit. Instead, I got irritation. "Mom, you can't keep calling me every time you don't feel well. I have responsibilities now. Maybe it's time you considered other living arrangements." Other living arrangements. The words hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't talking about getting me help or support. She was talking about getting me out of her life entirely. I realized in that moment that I had become nothing more than an inconvenience to the daughter I had given everything to raise. The signs had been there all along, but I had been too hopeful, too trusting, too blinded by love to see them clearly. My daughter didn't just want me out of her daily life. She wanted me erased from her story entirely, as if acknowledging where she came from would somehow diminish where she was going. The transformation from subtle dismissal to open hostility happened faster than I could have imagined. What started as polite distance became cruel indifference, and what began as embarrassment evolved into outright shame. Jessica no longer bothered to hide her feelings about having me in her life, and Derek seemed to take pleasure in my obvious discomfort during our increasingly rare interactions. The guest house they had built for me became less of a home and more of a prison. It was small, isolated from the main house, and positioned in a way that made it clear I was meant to be seen as little as possible. Jessica would make comments about how generous they were being, as if providing basic shelter for the woman who had sacrificed everything for her was some kind of extraordinary charity rather than the bare minimum of filial obligation. Derek's friends would visit, and I could hear them laughing in the backyard, their conversations peppered with comments about the help and jokes about family obligations. I knew they were talking about me, knew that I had become a source of entertainment for people who had never known what it meant to struggle, to sacrifice, to put someone else's needs before their own. The neighborhood association meetings became a particular source of humiliation. Derek was on the board, and he would come home with stories about complaints from neighbors about property values and neighborhood standards. He never said it directly, but the implication was clear. My presence was somehow diminishing the value of their precious community. Jessica started making rules about when I could use the pool, when I could have visitors, even when I could retrieve my mail. Each restriction was presented as a reasonable request, but together they formed a web of control that made me feel like a prisoner in what was supposed to be my home. I was being managed, contained, hidden away like a shameful secret. The social events became exercises in public humiliation. When I was invited at all, which became increasingly rare, I was seated at the children's table or with the hired help. Jessica would introduce me with a forced smile and then quickly move on, leaving me to make awkward conversation with people who clearly saw me as an oddity, a relic from a world they had never known and never wanted to understand. Derek began making comments about my mental state, suggesting to Jessica that I was becoming confused or difficult. He would point to perfectly normal behaviors, forgetting where I put my keys, asking questions about their plans, expressing opinions about current events, as evidence that I was declining and needed professional care. It was gaslighting at its most insidious, designed to make me question my own sanity and give them justification for whatever they were planning. The financial control became more overt. They took over my banking, claiming it was for my protection, but I could see them monitoring every purchase, questioning every expense. Derek would lecture me about unnecessary spending when I bought groceries or personal items, as if the money I had saved over decades of careful budgeting was somehow his to control. Jessica's friends began to avoid me entirely. When they saw me in the yard or around the neighborhood, they would look away or cross the street rather than acknowledge my existence. I had become a pariah in my own daughter's world, a source of embarrassment so profound that even basic human courtesy was too much to expect. The breaking point came during a neighborhood barbecue that Jessica was hosting. I had spent the morning helping her prepare, cooking dishes that I knew her guests would enjoy, setting up tables and decorations with the same care I had always put into making special occasions memorable. But when the guests arrived, Jessica pulled me aside with a look of panic in her eyes. "Mom, I need you to go back to the guest house. Derek's boss is here and, well, you understand." I didn't understand. I understood that my own daughter was so ashamed of me that she couldn't bear to have me present at her own party, in her own backyard, eating food that I had helped prepare. The humiliation was complete, the message crystal clear. I was not welcome in the life I had spent decades building for her. As I walked back to the guest house, I could hear the laughter and conversation continuing without me, as if my absence was a relief rather than a loss. I realized that I had become nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed, a problem to be solved, a burden to be hidden away until they could figure out a more permanent solution. The final blow came on a Tuesday morning in September, delivered with the casual cruelty that only family can achieve. I was tending to the small garden I had planted behind the guest house, the one spot where I felt I could still create something beautiful, when Jessica and Derek approached with expressions that I had learned to dread. They weren't coming to chat or check on my well-being. They were coming to deliver a verdict that had already been decided without my input. "Mom, we need to talk," Jessica said, her voice carrying that false sweetness that people use when they're about to destroy your world while pretending to do you a favor. Derek stood behind her like a sentinel, his arms crossed and his face set in that expression of righteous determination that I had come to hate. They had clearly rehearsed this moment, planned every word to minimize their guilt while maximizing my compliance. The words that followed will haunt me for the rest of my life. "The neighbors have been complaining. The homeowners association is threatening fines. You're ruining the aesthetic of our neighborhood, and frankly, it's affecting Derek's career prospects. We've found you a lovely little apartment across town. It's more suitable for someone your age, and you'll be much happier there." Ruining the aesthetic. Those 3 words contained everything I needed to know about how my own daughter saw me. I wasn't a person with feelings, needs, or dignity. I was a design flaw to be corrected, an eyesore to be removed, a problem that could be solved by simply making me disappear from their perfect little world. The woman who had raised her, sacrificed for her, loved her unconditionally, had become nothing more than an aesthetic problem. I tried to speak, to ask questions, to understand how we had reached this point, but Derek cut me off with a wave of his hand. "We've already put down the deposit," he said, as if my opinion was irrelevant to decisions about my own life. "The moving truck will be here Friday. We've hired people to pack your things, so you don't need to worry about anything." They had planned my exile without consulting me, made decisions about my future without considering my feelings, and were presenting it as if they were doing me a tremendous favor. The paternalistic condescension was breathtaking in its cruelty. They weren't just throwing me out, they were making me feel grateful for the privilege of being discarded. Jessica couldn't even look me in the eye as she delivered the final insult. "We'll visit, of course, once you're settled in. It'll be better this way, Mom. You'll see." But I could hear the lie in her voice, could see the relief in her posture. This wasn't about visits or maintaining our relationship. This was about erasing me from her life as completely and efficiently as possible. The apartment they had chosen was everything I had feared. Small, dark, located in a part of town where property values were low and hope was even lower. It was the kind of place where people went to be forgotten, where the elderly were warehoused until they had the decency to die quietly and without causing any further inconvenience. It was a prison sentence disguised as a gift. As I stood there in my garden, surrounded by the flowers I had planted and nurtured, listening to my daughter explain why I was no longer welcome in the life I had helped create, I felt something fundamental break inside me. Not just my heart, though that was shattered beyond repair, but my faith in the basic goodness of the people I had loved most in the world. But even as the devastation threatened to crush me completely, I felt something else stirring in the depths of my soul. It started as a whisper, barely audible above the sound of my breaking heart, but it grew stronger with each cruel word, each dismissive gesture, each moment of callous indifference. It was rage, pure and focused, the kind that comes from being pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. They thought they knew who I was, thought they understood what I was capable of. They saw an old woman, poor and powerless, someone who could be discarded without consequence. They had no idea that beneath the surface of the humble, self-sacrificing mother they had taken for granted was someone far more formidable than they could imagine. As I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, I saw a stranger wearing the face of the child I had loved. The woman standing before me was cold, calculating, and utterly without compassion for the person who had made her existence possible. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. I would not go quietly into the exile they had planned for me. They had underestimated me for the last time. I smiled then, a small, quiet smile that seemed to unnerve them both. "Of course," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Whatever you think is best." They relaxed visibly, relieved that I was going to make this easy for them, that I was going to be the compliant victim they expected me to be. They had no idea what they had just unleashed, what Jessica and Derek didn't know, what they could never have imagined in their wildest dreams, was that I had been preparing for this moment for over 3 years. You see, I'm not just the naive old woman they thought they could discard without consequence. I'm a survivor, a strategist, and someone who learned long ago that the world can be cruel to those who don't protect themselves. While they were whispering about my declining mental state and planning my exile, I was quietly, methodically, building an empire they never knew existed. It started when I first noticed the changes in Jessica's behavior, the subtle shifts that told me I was becoming a liability rather than a beloved mother. I began to pay attention to things I had never cared about before: property values, investment opportunities, the intricate web of financial relationships that held their precious neighborhood together. I spent hours at the library learning about real estate law, corporate structures, and the kind of financial instruments that people like Derek took for granted. The first property I bought was a small duplex 3 blocks away from their house. I paid cash, using money I had saved over decades of careful budgeting and frugal living. The seller was an elderly man who needed to move quickly, and I was able to negotiate a price well below market value. Jessica and Derek never knew about it because I used a trust structure that kept my name off the public records, but that was just the beginning. Over the next 2 years, I systematically acquired properties throughout their neighborhood and the surrounding area. I bought foreclosures, estate sales, and distressed properties, always paying cash, always working through intermediaries who kept my identity secret. I renovated them quietly, using contractors who worked nights and weekends, transforming rundown houses into desirable homes that commanded premium rents. The rental income was substantial, but I didn't spend it on myself. Instead, I reinvested every penny, buying more properties, expanding my portfolio, building wealth at a pace that would have shocked the daughter who thought I was too poor and simple to understand modern finance. I learned about tax shelters, depreciation schedules, and the 1,000 little tricks that wealthy people use to protect and grow their money. I also started a property management company, hiring experienced professionals to handle the day-to-day operations while I remained the silent owner. The company grew rapidly, acquiring contracts to manage properties for other investors who were impressed by our efficiency and profitability. Within 18 months, we were managing over 200 units across the city, but the real masterstroke was the commercial property. I identified a struggling shopping center on the edge of their neighborhood, a place that had been hemorrhaging tenants and losing money for years. The owners were desperate to sell, and I was able to acquire it for a fraction of its potential value. I spent 6 months renovating it, bringing in new tenants, and transforming it into a thriving commercial hub that generated substantial monthly income. All of this was done in complete secrecy. I used shell companies, trust structures, and legal entities that kept my name hidden from public view. To Jessica and Derek, I was still the poor old woman living in their guest house, dependent on their charity and grateful for their minimal generosity. They had no idea that I was becoming one of the largest property owners in their area, that I was building wealth that dwarfed their own. The irony was delicious. While Derek was bragging about his success in finance, making condescending comments about people who didn't understand money, I was quietly outmaneuvering him in his own backyard. While Jessica was embarrassed by my simple clothes and modest lifestyle, I was accumulating assets that would have made her social climbing friends green with envy. I also began documenting everything, every cruel comment, every act of financial manipulation, every moment of emotional abuse. I recorded conversations, saved text messages, and kept detailed records of their treatment of me. I knew that when the time came to reveal the truth, I would need evidence that couldn't be disputed or explained away. The final piece of the puzzle was the neighborhood itself. I discovered that several of the homeowners were struggling financially, victims of Derek's investment advice that had gone badly wrong. They were facing foreclosure, bankruptcy, and the loss of their dream homes. I began quietly approaching them, offering to buy their properties at fair market value, giving them a way out of their financial difficulties while adding to my growing empire. By the time Jessica and Derek decided to throw me out, I owned or controlled nearly 40% of the properties in their exclusive neighborhood. I was their landlord, their neighbor's landlord, and in many cases, the silent partner in the very businesses that generated their community's wealth. They thought they were exiling a powerless old woman, but they were actually declaring war on someone who held more power in their world than they could possibly imagine. The morning they told me I was ruining their aesthetic, I almost laughed out loud. If they only knew that the woman they were discarding owned the very ground they stood on, that their perfect little world existed at my discretion, that with a single phone call I could turn their lives upside down in ways they couldn't even comprehend. But I didn't reveal my hand. Not yet. I smiled, nodded, and played the role of the compliant victim they expected me to be. Because the best revenge isn't just about winning. It's about making sure your enemies never see it coming until it's far too late to do anything about it. The month between their ultimatum and my supposed exile was the most satisfying period of my life, though they never suspected why. While Jessica and Derek congratulated themselves on finally solving their mother problem, I was putting the finishing touches on a plan that would reshape their world in ways they couldn't imagine. They thought they were watching a defeated old woman pack her meager belongings, but they were actually witnessing the calm before a storm that would leave their lives in ruins. I played my part perfectly. I appeared sad, resigned, grateful for their generosity in finding me a place to live. I thanked them repeatedly for their patience and understanding, apologized for being such a burden, and promised to stay out of their way once I was settled in my new apartment. They ate it up, relieved that their guilt could be assuaged by my apparent acceptance of their decision. Derek became particularly insufferable during this period. He would make comments about how this was really for the best, how I would be much happier around people my own age, how they were doing the right thing, even though it was difficult for them. The condescension was breathtaking, but I nodded along, letting him believe that his transparent attempts at self-justification were actually comforting to me. Jessica threw herself into redecorating the guest house, talking excitedly about converting it into a home office or maybe a yoga studio. She spoke about these plans in front of me, as if I were already gone, as if my presence was so temporary and insignificant that it didn't matter what I heard. She was already erasing me from her life, mentally rearranging her world to eliminate any trace of the woman who had made her existence possible. Their friends rallied around them, praising their difficult decision and offering support for their sacrifice. I heard them talking at dinner parties, discussing the challenges of caring for aging parents, the burden of family obligations, the necessity of making hard choices for everyone's well-being. They spoke about me like I was a problem that had been solved, a weight that had been lifted from Jessica's shoulders. But while they were patting themselves on the back for their cruelty, I was making final preparations for their destruction. I met with lawyers, accountants, and property managers, ensuring that every detail of my plan was legally sound and practically executable. I reviewed contracts, signed documents, and transferred assets, building the framework for what would become the most comprehensive revenge in the history of their precious neighborhood. The commercial property I owned was about to undergo a major transformation. I had secured permits for a low-income housing development, complete with subsidized units and social services. The zoning was already approved, the contractors were already hired, and construction would begin the day after I was supposed to move out. Their exclusive neighborhood was about to become a lot more diverse, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. I also finalized the purchase of the country club, where Derek played golf and conducted much of his business. The previous owners were struggling with debt and were eager to sell to someone who could pay cash immediately. I planned to convert it into a community center, offering services to low-income families and recent immigrants. Derek's sanctuary was about to become everything he despised. The rental properties I owned throughout the neighborhood were about to change as well. I had been quietly allowing leases to expire without renewal, preparing to fill them with tenants who would horrify the current residents. Section 8, recipients, large families, people with disabilities, immigrants, and anyone else who didn't fit the narrow definition of acceptability that defined their community. But perhaps the most satisfying part of my plan involved the homeowners association that had been used as a weapon against me. I had discovered that several board members, including Derek, had been embezzling funds for years, using association money for personal expenses and investment schemes. I had documented everything, and I was prepared to expose their corruption in the most public and humiliating way possible. I spent my evenings walking through the neighborhood, looking at the houses I now owned, the businesses I controlled, the lives I was about to turn upside down. The irony was intoxicating. They had tried to exile me from a world that I actually owned, had attempted to banish me from a kingdom where I was the secret ruler. Jessica and Derek continued to treat me with casual cruelty, making jokes about my new, downsized lifestyle, offering patronizing advice about adjusting to apartment living, and counting down the days until they would be free of my presence. They were so focused on their anticipated relief that they never noticed the small smile that played at the corners of my mouth, the quiet confidence that had replaced my earlier despair. The moving truck arrived on schedule, and I watched them load my few belongings with a mixture of genuine sadness and secret anticipation. I was losing the last connection to my daughter, the final thread that tied me to the family I had created and nurtured. But I was also about to embark on the most satisfying chapter of my life, one where justice would finally be served and accounts would finally be settled. As the truck pulled away, Jessica and Derek stood on their front porch, waving goodbye with obvious relief. They thought they were watching the end of their problems, the final solution to their aesthetic concerns. They had no idea they were actually witnessing the beginning of their worst nightmare, the first scene in a drama that would destroy everything they had worked to build. The silence before the storm was over. The reckoning was about to begin. The revelation began at exactly 9 a.m. on a Monday morning, 3 weeks after they had exiled me from their perfect world. I had chosen the timing carefully. Derek would be at his office, Jessica would be at her yoga class, and the entire neighborhood would be going about their normal routines, completely unprepared for the earthquake that was about to shatter their comfortable existence. The first sign that something was wrong came when Derek arrived at his office to find it surrounded by federal agents. The FBI had received an anonymous tip about financial irregularities at his firm, complete with detailed documentation of his embezzlement from the Homeowners Association and his fraudulent investment schemes. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and had been gift-wrapped for investigators who were always eager to take down white-collar criminals. While Derek was being led away in handcuffs, Jessica was receiving her own devastating news. The country club where she spent her mornings had been sold overnight, and the new owner was converting it into a community center for refugees and low-income families. Her sanctuary, the place where she had cultivated her social connections and maintained her status, was about to become everything she had spent years trying to escape. But that was just the beginning. Throughout the neighborhood, for sale signs began appearing on properties that had been rental units all along, properties that I had owned for years, while their occupants lived in ignorance of their true landlord. The signs announced that these homes would be converted to low-income housing, complete with subsidized rent and social services. The commercial development I had been planning was also announced that morning. The empty lot at the edge of their neighborhood, the one they had assumed would remain undeveloped forever, was about to become a 200-unit affordable housing complex. The permits were already approved, the contractors were already hired, and construction would begin immediately. Jessica's phone started ringing before she even made it home from her yoga class. Neighbors were calling in panic, demanding to know what was happening, how their exclusive enclave was being invaded by the very people they had worked so hard to exclude. The property values that had been their obsession were about to plummet, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. When she finally made it home, Jessica found a letter waiting for her, delivered by certified mail and signed by a law firm she had never heard of. The letter informed her that the guest house where I had lived, the one she was so eager to convert into her personal space, was actually owned by a trust that had been established years earlier. She had no legal right to modify it, and the trust was demanding immediate payment for 3 years of back rent. The letter also informed her that the main house, the one she thought she and Derek owned free and clear, was actually subject to a lien that had been filed years earlier. The lien was for an amount that exceeded the home's current value, and payment was due immediately. If they couldn't pay, the house would be foreclosed upon and sold at auction. Derek's arrest made the evening news, complete with footage of him being perp-walked out of his office building. The reporter described him as the alleged mastermind of a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme that had defrauded dozens of investors and homeowners associations. His reputation, his career, his entire professional identity was destroyed in a single news cycle. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. That evening, as Jessica sat in her living room trying to process the destruction of her world, she received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. When she answered, she heard a voice she knew all too well, though it sounded different now, stronger, more confident, tinged with an authority she had never heard before. "Hello, Jessica," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I thought you should know that I've purchased your mortgage from the bank. You're now officially my tenant, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to vacate the premises. You see, you're ruining the aesthetic of my neighborhood." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear her breathing, could almost feel her shock and disbelief radiating through the phone. Finally, she found her voice. "Mom? What? How? I don't understand." "Oh, my dear daughter," I replied, savoring every word. "There's so much you don't understand. Did you really think that the woman who raised you, who sacrificed everything for your success, who managed to put you through college on a waitress's salary, was too stupid to understand money? Did you really believe that I would let you destroy me without consequences?" I explained it all then. The properties I had bought, the businesses I had acquired, the empire I had built, while she was busy being embarrassed by my existence. I told her about the trust funds, the shell companies, the legal structures that had kept my wealth hidden from her greedy eyes. I described the months of planning, the careful documentation, the patient accumulation of power that had led to this moment. "You wanted me gone because I was ruining your aesthetic," I continued. "Well, congratulations. You got your wish. I'm gone, but I'm taking your world with me. Every property you can see from your window, every business you frequent, every social space you consider sacred, I own it all, and I'm going to transform it into everything you despise." The conversation ended with Jessica sobbing, begging for forgiveness, promising to make amends. But it was too late for apologies, too late for regret, too late for anything except the complete and total destruction of the life she had built on the foundation of my sacrifice and her own cruelty. As I hung up the phone, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I had ever experienced. Justice had been served, accounts had been settled, and the daughter who had discarded me like garbage was finally learning the true cost of her betrayal. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in the complete and utter destruction of everything Jessica and Derek had worked to build. Their world didn't just collapse, it was systematically dismantled, piece by piece, dollar by dollar, relationship by relationship, until nothing remained of the life they had constructed on the foundation of their cruelty to me. Derek's legal troubles multiplied exponentially. The FBI investigation revealed a web of financial crimes that stretched back years, involving not just the Homeowners Association funds, but also client money, pension funds, and investment schemes that had defrauded hundreds of people. The media coverage was relentless, painting him as the poster child for white-collar greed and corruption. His assets were frozen, his accounts seized, and his future reduced to the prospect of decades in federal prison. Jessica's social destruction was equally complete. The friends who had once praised her for making the difficult decision to exile me now shunned her, horrified by the revelation that she had thrown out the mother who had secretly owned half their neighborhood. The charity boards that had welcomed her membership suddenly found reasons to exclude her. The social events that had defined her identity were no longer available to the wife of a convicted felon. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of their downfall was watching them lose the very thing they had valued most, their precious aesthetic. The neighborhood they had worked so hard to keep exclusive was transformed into a diverse, vibrant community that welcomed people from all walks of life. The affordable housing complex I built attracted families who brought children's laughter to streets that had been sterile and silent. The community center that replaced their country club became a hub of activity, offering services to immigrants, seniors, and anyone else who needed support. The property values they had obsessed over plummeted, but the community became richer in ways they had never understood. There were block parties where people actually talked to each other, community gardens where neighbors worked together, and a sense of belonging that their exclusive enclave had never possessed. I had not just destroyed their world, I had replaced it with something better. Jessica tried repeatedly to contact me, leaving voicemails that progressed from anger to bargaining to desperate pleading. She offered to make amends, to change her ways, to somehow undo the damage she had caused. But her words rang hollow, motivated not by genuine remorse, but by the desperate desire to escape the consequences of her actions. I listened to every message, but I never responded. There was nothing she could say that would change what had happened. No apology that could repair the relationship she had destroyed through years of calculated cruelty. She had made her choice when she decided that I was an embarrassment to be hidden away. Now she would live with the consequences of that choice. The legal proceedings continued for months, with Derek eventually pleading guilty to multiple felonies and receiving a sentence of 15 years in federal prison. Jessica lost their house, their cars, their savings, and their social standing. She was forced to move into a small apartment across town, ironically, in the same complex where they had planned to exile me. But as I watched their lives unravel, I found myself experiencing a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction, certainly, the deep, primal satisfaction of seeing justice served and accounts settled. But there was also sadness, a profound grief for the family that could have been, for the daughter who had chosen status over love, for the relationships that had been destroyed by greed and social climbing. I thought often about the woman I had been before all of this began. The devoted mother who had believed that unconditional love would always be returned, who had sacrificed everything for a daughter who would eventually see her as nothing more than an aesthetic problem. That woman was gone, replaced by someone harder, more cynical, more aware of the darkness that can exist in human hearts. The money I had accumulated through my real estate empire was substantial, but it felt hollow compared to the family I had lost. I had won the war, but the victory came at a cost that sometimes felt too high to bear. I had proven that I was not the powerless old woman they had thought they could discard. But in doing so, I had also lost the last vestiges of the loving mother I had once been. Yet, as I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized that I had also gained something valuable: self-respect. For too many years, I had allowed myself to be taken for granted, to be treated as less than I was worth. I had accepted crumbs of affection and called it love, had endured disrespect and called it family loyalty. The betrayal, as painful as it was, had forced me to recognize my own worth and demand the respect I deserved. I had learned that love without respect is not love at all, but exploitation. I had learned that family is not defined by blood alone, but by loyalty, kindness, and mutual care. I had learned that sometimes, the people who claim to love you most are the ones most capable of destroying you. These were hard lessons, but they were also liberating ones. The empire I had built would continue to grow, providing homes for people who needed them and services for communities that had been overlooked. The wealth I had accumulated would be used to help others who found themselves in situations similar to my own. Elderly people discarded by their families, vulnerable individuals exploited by those they trusted. My revenge was complete, but it was also the beginning of something new. A legacy built not on the foundation of family obligation, but on the bedrock of justice, dignity, and the unshakable belief that every person deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their age, their wealth, or their usefulness to others. 3 years have passed since the day I bought the neighborhood that had rejected me, and I find myself in a place I never expected to be, at peace with the choices I made, and proud of the legacy I'm building. The woman who was once discarded for ruining the aesthetic has become the architect of a community that values substance over superficiality, compassion over status, and genuine human connection over artificial social hierarchies. The healing process was not immediate or easy. For months after my revenge was complete, I struggled with conflicting emotions, satisfaction at seeing justice served, but also grief for the family relationships that had been irreparably damaged. I had won the war, but victory came with a price that sometimes felt overwhelming. The mother in me mourned the daughter I had lost, even as the woman in me celebrated the dignity I had reclaimed. I began working with a therapist who specialized in family trauma and elder abuse. Through our sessions, I came to understand that my actions were not born of vindictiveness, but of a fundamental need to reclaim my worth and dignity. I had not destroyed my family. They had destroyed themselves through their own choices, their own greed, their own inability to value the person who had given them everything. The community I had created began to flourish in ways that exceeded my wildest expectations. The affordable housing complex became a model for inclusive development, attracting families who brought life and energy to streets that had once been sterile and unwelcoming. The community center offered programs for children, seniors, immigrants, and anyone else who needed support or connection. I established a foundation dedicated to preventing elder abuse and supporting families in crisis. The foundation provides legal aid to elderly people who are being exploited by their relatives, offers counseling services to families struggling with intergenerational conflict, and creates educational programs about the warning signs of financial and emotional abuse. My real estate empire continued to grow, but I managed it with a different philosophy than the typical investor. I kept rents affordable, maintained properties to high standards, and created opportunities for tenants to eventually become homeowners. I wanted to build wealth, but I also wanted to build community, something that had been missing from the sterile perfection of Jessica's neighborhood. The relationships I formed during this period were deeper and more meaningful than any I had experienced in years. I connected with other women who had faced similar betrayals, forming a support network of survivors who understood the unique pain of being discarded by the people you love most. I also developed friendships with tenants, community center volunteers, and local business owners who valued me for who I was, not what I could provide. Jessica made one final attempt to reconcile about 2 years after Derek's conviction. She appeared at my door, looking older and more worn than I remembered, carrying a letter she had written but seemed afraid to deliver. We sat in my living room, the same room where she had once told me I was ruining her aesthetic, and she tried to explain, to apologize, to somehow bridge the chasm that her choices had created. She spoke about the pressure she had felt to fit in, the fear of being judged by Derek's family and friends, the way she had convinced herself that hiding me was somehow protecting me from their judgment. She cried as she described the loneliness of her new life, the way former friends crossed the street to avoid her, the shame of being known as the woman who had thrown away her mother. I listened without interrupting, watching this broken woman who had once been my beloved daughter. When she finished, I spoke quietly but firmly. I forgive you, Jessica, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve the peace that comes with letting go of anger. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean pretending that what happened didn't matter. You made choices that destroyed our relationship, and those choices have consequences that can't be undone. She left that day with tears in her eyes, and I never saw her again. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she eventually moved to another state, trying to rebuild her life away from the wreckage of her past. I hope she found peace, but I also hope she never forgot the lesson about the true cost of valuing appearances over love. The grandchildren I never had the chance to know have reached out as they've gotten older, curious about the grandmother who had been erased from their family story. I've met with a few of them, sharing stories about their mother's childhood and the family history they never knew. These relationships are tentative and careful, built on the understanding that we are essentially strangers trying to find common ground across a chasm of lost years. My legacy is not what I once imagined it would be. I had dreamed of being remembered as the devoted mother and grandmother who sacrificed everything for her family's happiness. Instead, I will be remembered as the woman who refused to be discarded, who fought back against betrayal, who chose dignity over false peace. The foundation I established will continue my work long after I'm gone, helping other elderly people who find themselves in situations similar to mine. The community I built will serve as a model for inclusive development that values people over profit. The properties I own will continue to provide affordable housing for families who need it most. To anyone who might hear this story, I want to leave you with this truth. It is never too late to stand up for yourself, never too late to demand the respect you deserve, never too late to choose your own dignity over someone else's convenience. The strength you need is already inside you, waiting for the moment when you decide that you are worth fighting for. I am 81 years old now, and I have learned that family is not defined by blood alone, but by love, respect, and mutual care. I have learned that wealth is not just about money, but about the richness of relationships built on genuine affection rather than obligation. I have learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone else's cruelty. My story is not a tragedy, despite all the pain it contains. It is a story of transformation, of a woman who refused to let betrayal define her final chapters. I am not the victim of my daughter's choices. I am the author of my own redemption. And in choosing to fight back, to demand better, to build something meaningful from the ashes of my broken family, I have found a peace and purpose that no one can ever take away from me. This is my legacy, not the broken woman they tried to create, but the strong woman I chose to become. And that perhaps is the greatest victory of all.